Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into the frozen wasteland of Canada's Yukon territory, where the endless winter darkness conceals secrets that would make even the bravest souls question their sanity. From the abandoned mining camps of Dawson City to the desolate shores of Lake LaBerge, we will uncover 10 disturbing true accounts that have been buried beneath layers of ice and silence for decades. These are not mere campfire tales or urban legends whispered in the safety of civilization. These are documented encounters with pure evil, unexplained disappearances that defied all logic, and horrifying discoveries that authorities desperately tried to keep hidden from the public eye. Each story comes from real witnesses who lived through experiences so terrifying that many refuse to speak of them even today. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of the Yukon wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Claire Bouchard, and I work as a dispatcher for the RCMP in Whitehorse. I have been taking emergency calls for over 8 years now, and in that time I have heard some truly disturbing things come through those radio waves. Domestic violence calls, hunting accidents, missing persons reports, drug overdoses. You learn to compartmentalize, to keep your emotions in check when someone on the other end of the line is having the worst day of their lives. But there is one call that still haunts me today. A call that came in on a frigid Tuesday morning in February of 2019. That was the day Emma Rousseau called to report that her boyfriend, Marcus LeBlanc, had not returned from what should have been a simple salvage run to the abandoned Bear Creek compound. Marcus was a 34-year-old mining equipment operator who had worked the goldfields around Dawson City for nearly a decade. He was one of those rugged Yukon men who could fix anything with an engine, troubleshoot hydraulic systems in sub-zero temperatures, and navigate the backcountry roads even during the worst blizzards. Emma had been dating him for about 3 years, and she told me that Marcus was the most reliable person she knew. He always called when he said he would call, always came home when he promised to be home. That is why she was so concerned when he failed to return from his trip to Bear Creek on Sunday evening as planned. According to Emma, Marcus had left early Saturday morning in his blue Ford pickup truck to drive the 10 kilometers east of Dawson City to the old Bear Creek compound. The abandoned mining complex, which had once been the headquarters for the Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation from 1905 to 1966, was now owned by Parks Canada. While public tours had been discontinued years earlier due to environmental concerns, particularly mercury contamination from the gold extraction processes, the site was occasionally opened for special events. Marcus had heard through his network of fellow equipment operators that there were still some valuable parts and machinery left in the compound's massive machine shop. Hydraulic pumps, electrical components, steel cables, things that could be refurbished and used in current mining operations. Emma explained that Marcus had gotten permission from Parks Canada to survey the site and potentially salvage some of the abandoned equipment. He had all the proper documentation, had paid the required fees, and had even arranged to have any materials he removed properly documented for environmental safety reasons. This was not some illegal scavenging operation. Marcus was a professional who followed all the regulations. He had told Emma that he planned to spend Saturday surveying what was available, camp overnight in his truck, and then load up anything worthwhile on Sunday before driving back to Whitehorse. When Sunday evening came and went with no word from Marcus, Emma had initially assumed that he had found more equipment than expected and decided to stay an extra day to load everything properly. But when Monday passed with no phone call, no text message, and no sign of his distinctive blue Ford truck, Emma knew something was wrong. Marcus carried a satellite phone precisely for situations like this. The Yukon backcountry had plenty of dead zones for cell service, but satellite communication worked anywhere with a clear view of the sky. The fact that he was not responding to calls or messages on either his regular phone or the satellite device meant that something had gone very wrong. That was when Emma decided to call the RCMP. I took Emma's call at exactly 9:47 a.m. on that Tuesday morning. She was clearly trying to keep her voice steady, but I could hear the underlying panic in her tone. She gave me all the relevant information: Marcus's full name, the license plate number of his truck, the exact location where he had gone, and the timeline of when he was supposed to return. I assured her that we would send a patrol unit out to Bear Creek immediately to check on him. What I did not tell her, because I did not want to worry her further, was that we had already received reports of unusual activity in that area over the weekend. 2 different callers had contacted us on Sunday evening to report hearing what sounded like someone screaming in the vicinity of Bear Creek compound. Both callers lived several kilometers away from the site, but sound travels far in the cold, dry air of the Yukon winter. The screams had been brief, lasting only a few minutes each time, but loud enough and disturbing enough that the witnesses felt compelled to call police. At the time, we had assumed it might be someone calling for help after a vehicle breakdown or minor accident. We had sent a patrol car to check the main access road to Bear Creek, but the officer had not seen any vehicles or signs of distress. The screaming had stopped by the time our unit arrived, and there had been no follow-up reports. Now, with Marcus missing and Emma's call connecting the timeline, those screams took on a much more sinister significance. I immediately dispatched 2 patrol units to Bear Creek compound with instructions to conduct a thorough search of the entire area. I also contacted our search and rescue coordinator to put them on standby in case we needed helicopter support or additional ground teams. Something about this situation felt wrong from the very beginning, though I could not put my finger on exactly what was bothering me. The first patrol unit arrived at Bear Creek at approximately 11:15 a.m. What they found there defied all logical explanation and remains one of the most disturbing crime scenes I have ever been involved with, even though I was not physically present. The officer's radio report came through with obvious confusion and concern in his voice. He had located Marcus's blue Ford pickup truck parked in the main compound area, positioned near the entrance to the massive machine shop building, exactly where someone conducting a salvage survey would logically park. The truck's engine was still running. After sitting there for nearly 3 days, in temperatures that had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius at night, the engine was still running. The fuel gauge showed that the tank was nearly empty, meaning the truck had been idling continuously since Marcus had arrived on Saturday morning. The driver's side door was standing wide open, and there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, despite the fact that fresh snow had fallen on Sunday night. It was as if Marcus had simply vanished into thin air the moment he stepped out of his truck. But the most disturbing detail was what the officers found inside the cab of the truck. On the passenger seat was Marcus's heavy winter jacket, the insulated parka that no one would voluntarily remove in sub-zero temperatures. The jacket was soaked with blood, fresh blood that had not yet frozen despite the extreme cold. The fabric was torn in several places, ripped, as if it had been violently pulled or clawed off someone's body. There were also scratches on the interior of the truck's cab, deep gouges in the plastic dashboard, and door panels that looked like they had been made by fingernails or claws. On the dashboard, next to a thermos that still contained warm coffee, was Marcus's satellite phone. The device was functional and showed full battery life, but there were no outgoing calls or messages after Saturday morning. His regular cell phone was found on the floor of the truck, the screen cracked, as if it had been dropped or thrown. Most unsettling of all, the truck's radio was tuned to the emergency frequency, and the volume was turned up to maximum, as if Marcus had been trying to call for help, but had been interrupted before he could speak. The search team immediately expanded their investigation to the surrounding area. They examined every building in the Bear Creek compound, searching through the machine shop, the administrative buildings, the old residential structures, and the maintenance facilities. They found no sign of Marcus, no blood trail, no indication of where he might have gone after leaving his truck. The only unusual discovery was in the machine shop itself. where several pieces of heavy equipment had been moved from their original positions. Massive hydraulic pumps and steel machinery that would normally require specialized tools and multiple people to relocate had been shifted around as if someone or something with enormous strength had been rearranging them. I remained in radio contact with the search teams throughout the day, coordinating additional resources and relaying information back to Emma and other family members who had gathered at the detachment. By late afternoon, we had helicopter units conducting aerial searches of the entire Klondike River Valley, ground teams following every possible trail and access, road, and even specialized cadaver dogs brought in from Edmonton. The search effort continued for 6 days, involving dozens of volunteers from the local community and professional search and rescue personnel from across the territory. We never found Marcus LeBlanc, not a single trace of him beyond that blood-soaked jacket in his truck. The investigation officially remains open, classified as a missing person case, but everyone involved knows that something terrible happened to Marcus at Bear Creek Compound that Saturday morning. The blood evidence confirmed that he had suffered significant trauma, enough to be considered life-threatening. The torn jacket and scratched interior of his truck suggested a violent struggle, but the complete absence of any trail leading away from the vehicle, combined with the impossibly heavy equipment that had been moved in the machine shop, pointed to something that did not fit any normal criminal scenario. 3 months after Marcus disappeared, Emma received a letter from Parks Canada informing her that Bear Creek Compound was being permanently closed to all public access. The official reason given was environmental remediation and safety concerns. But those of us who had been involved in the investigation knew the real reason. Too many strange incidents had been reported at that site over the years. Equipment mysteriously moved overnight, unexplained sounds coming from the abandoned buildings, and now Marcus's disappearance. Whatever was happening at Bear Creek, the authorities had decided that it was too dangerous to allow anyone else to visit. To this day, local residents report hearing screaming from the direction of Bear Creek Compound on cold winter nights when the wind is still. The sounds are always brief, lasting just a few minutes, but loud enough to carry for kilometers across the frozen landscape. Some people claim the screaming sounds like Marcus calling for help, though that could just be the imagination of people who knew him and remember the case. What I know for certain is that Marcus LeBlanc went to Bear Creek Compound to salvage some equipment on a routine Saturday morning, and he never came home. His truck was found running with the door open and his jacket soaked in blood, but Marcus himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. When I was 16 years old, my cousin Etienne and I were camping along Mayo River during the summer solstice when something emerged from the water that defied explanation. This was back in June of 1997, and we had just finished our sophomore year at Robert Service High School in Dawson City. Our parents thought it would be good for us to spend some time outdoors, away from video games and television, so they had arranged for us to spend a week camping at McIntyre Park just outside the small community of Mayo. The park sits right on the banks of the Mayo River, and our families had been using it as a summer retreat destination for as long as I could remember. My name is Jean-Baptiste Morin, and I need to tell you about what happened during that camping trip, because it changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Etienne was my first cousin, the son of my father's younger brother, and we had grown up together like brothers. He was always the more adventurous of the two of us, the one who convinced me to explore places we probably should not have been exploring, the one who talked me into staying up past midnight to go fishing when we should have been sleeping. That particular week in June, we had convinced our parents to let us camp alone for the first time, without adult supervision, arguing that we were responsible enough to handle ourselves for a few days. McIntyre Park was the perfect place for that kind of independence. The campground was well maintained by the village of Mayo, with proper facilities and regular patrols by local authorities, but it was also remote enough that we felt like we were having a real wilderness adventure. The Mayo River runs wide and clear through that area, fed by snowmelt from the mountains and countless smaller streams and creeks. The water is cold year-round, even in the middle of summer, but it is also incredibly clean and filled with Arctic grayling, northern pike, and other fish that make for excellent eating when you cook them over an open fire. We had set up our tent in a spot about 50 meters back from the riverbank, in a grove of white spruce trees that provided good shelter from the wind and some privacy from the other campers who were scattered around the park. Our fishing gear was the latest and greatest that our parents could afford. Spinning rods with high-quality reels, tackle boxes filled with every type of lure and bait we thought we might need, and even a small aluminum boat that we had trailered up from Dawson City specifically for this trip. We spent the first 3 days of our week-long camping trip catching fish during the day and cooking them over our campfire in the evening, feeling very proud of ourselves for living off the land like our ancestors had done. It was on the 4th night, June 21st, the summer solstice and the longest day of the year in the Yukon, that everything changed. The sun had finally set around 11:30 p.m., though it never gets truly dark during that time of year at our latitude. Instead, the sky takes on this beautiful twilight glow that lasts for hours, providing just enough light to see clearly, but creating an otherworldly atmosphere that makes everything look slightly unreal. Etienne had suggested that we take advantage of the twilight fishing, claiming that the grayling would be more active during the cooler evening hours. I was tired and would have preferred to go to sleep, but he convinced me that this might be our best chance to catch the big northern pike that had been eluding us all week. We launched our small boat around midnight and paddled out to the middle of the Mayo River, where the current was slower and the water was deeper. The river at that point was probably about 80 meters wide, with gravel bars and small islands creating channels and eddies that were perfect for fish habitat. We anchored in a spot where we had seen fish jumping earlier in the day and began casting our lines, using red and white spoons that were supposed to be irresistible to northern pike. The night was perfectly calm, with no wind and only the gentle sound of water flowing around our boat and the occasional splash of a fish jumping somewhere in the darkness. For about an hour, we had moderate success, catching several decent-sized grayling and one small pike that we released because it was below the size limit. We were working quietly, communicating mostly through hand gestures and whispers so as not to disturb the fish or wake up any other campers who might be sleeping nearby. The twilight was beginning to fade into true darkness when Etienne suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed toward the far shore of the river. Something was moving in the water, creating a V-shaped wake as it swam directly toward our boat. At first, we thought it was a beaver, which would not have been unusual. Beavers are common throughout the Yukon, and they are strong swimmers who often move around at night. The size of the wake suggested something about the right size for a large beaver, and the steady, purposeful way it was moving through the water was consistent with beaver behavior. We both relaxed and continued fishing, expecting the animal to either ignore us completely or give our boat a wide berth once it realized we were there. Beavers are generally not aggressive toward humans unless they feel cornered or threatened. But as the creature got closer, it became apparent that this was not a beaver. The swimming pattern was wrong for one thing. Beavers swim with their heads above water and their backs partially submerged, creating a distinctive silhouette. This thing was swimming with only the very top of its head visible, moving through the water with a fluid, almost serpentine motion that no beaver could achieve. The wake it was creating was also too large and too consistent, suggesting something much bigger and more powerful than any beaver we had ever seen. When it reached the shallow water near our boat, the creature suddenly stood upright, not like a human standing up in waist-deep water, but like something that was designed to be bipedal, rising smoothly from a swimming position to a standing position without any of the awkwardness that would be expected from a four-legged animal trying to stand on its hind legs. It was now about 10 meters away from our boat, and we could see it clearly in the fading twilight. What we saw made no sense according to anything we knew about the natural world. The creature stood approximately 2.5 meters tall with elongated limbs that seemed slightly out of proportion for its torso. Its skin appeared to be dark, either naturally dark-colored or wet enough to appear dark in the dim light. But the most disturbing feature was its eyes, which were glowing with a steady yellow light, like the reflective eyes of a cat or dog caught in headlights, but much brighter and more intense. The glow was strong enough that we could see details of the creature's face, which was vaguely humanoid, but with features that were subtly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate a human face from memory, but had gotten the proportions slightly off. For several minutes, the creature simply stood there in the water, watching us with those glowing yellow eyes. Neither Etienne nor I moved or spoke. We were both frozen with a combination of fear and fascination, unable to process what we were seeing, but instinctively understanding that we were in the presence of something that should not exist. The creature showed no signs of aggression, but there was something deeply unsettling about its stillness, the way it stood perfectly motionless while studying us with obvious intelligence. Then it spoke to us in perfect French, not the French that we spoke in school or heard on television, but the old-fashioned French that our grandparents used, full of expressions and pronunciations that had been preserved in the Yukon long after they had disappeared from France itself. Its voice was clear and strong, carrying easily across the water despite the fact that it was speaking in a normal conversational tone. What it said to us changed everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. Vous ne devriez pas être ici pendant que la terre se réveille, it said. You should not be here while the earth is awakening. Le pergélisol fond, et des choses qui devraient rester enterrées remontent à la surface. The permafrost is melting, and things that should stay buried are rising to the surface. Before either of us could respond, the creature raised one elongated arm and pointed toward the riverbank behind us. Suddenly, our vision was filled with images that were not coming through our eyes, but directly into our minds. We saw the Yukon landscape as it had existed thousands of years ago during the last ice age, populated by massive creatures that dwarfed anything in the modern world. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and other prehistoric megafauna roamed across vast grasslands where forests now stood. But these were not the familiar Ice Age animals that we had learned about in school. Mixed in with the mammoths and giant beavers were creatures that belonged in nightmares, rather than any paleontology textbook. Things with too many legs or eyes, predators with impossible anatomies, and worst of all, beings that looked almost human, but were clearly something else entirely. We watched in horror as these nightmare creatures hunted and killed both the familiar Ice Age animals and each other, turning the ancient landscape into a battleground of unimaginable violence. The vision shifted, and we saw these creatures dying as the climate changed at the end of the Ice Age. But instead of simply becoming extinct, they were being frozen into the permafrost that was forming as the earth cooled. The creature in the river showed us layer after layer of permanently frozen ground, each containing the preserved remains of things that had lived and died during different periods of the Earth's history. Some of these remains were still alive, not dead but dormant, waiting for the ice to melt and release them back into the world. As the vision continued, we saw the present-day Yukon, with mining equipment and human activity causing the permafrost to thaw more rapidly than it ever had before. We watched as the melting ice released first the familiar Ice Age animals that paleontologists were already discovering, then the DNA and bacteria from prehistoric organisms, and finally the things that were still alive, still waiting, still hungry after tens of thousands of years of frozen sleep. The creature lowered its arm, and the visions stopped as abruptly as they had begun. We were back in our boat on the Mayo River, staring at something that should not exist, while our minds struggled to process what we had just been shown. The The creature looked at us for a few more moments, then spoke again in that same clear, ancient French. Dites aux autres ce que vous avez vu, it said. Tell the others what you have seen. Le temps presse, et ils doivent se préparer. Time is running short, and they must prepare. Without another word, the creature sank back beneath the surface of the river and disappeared. One moment, it was standing there in the shallow water. The next moment, there were only ripples spreading outward from where it had been. Etienne and I sat in our boat for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, waiting to see if it would resurface or if anything else would happen. When it became clear that the encounter was over, we paddled back to shore as quickly as we could and spent the rest of the night sitting by our campfire, too frightened and too confused to sleep. We broke camp the next morning and drove back to Dawson City, cutting our camping trip short by 2 days. When our parents asked why we had returned early, we told them that we had gotten bored and missed home. We never told anyone about what we had seen in the Mayo River that night. Not our parents, not our friends, not anyone. Who would have believed us? 2 teenage boys claiming to have met some kind of water creature that could speak French and show them visions of prehistoric monsters. We would have been laughed at, or worse, sent for psychological evaluation. But the years that followed proved that the creature had been telling us the truth. Etienne went on to study geology at the University of Alberta, and later became a specialist in permafrost research, working for the Yukon Geological Survey. His career has been dedicated to studying the effects of climate change on frozen ground, and he has confirmed everything that the creature showed us that night. The permafrost is indeed melting at an unprecedented rate, releasing preserved organic material that has been frozen for thousands of years. The scientific discoveries that have been made in the Yukon over the past 2 decades read like a catalog of the visions we were shown. Perfectly preserved woolly mammoth calves, ancient wolf pups with their DNA intact, and most disturbing of all, microorganisms and bacteria that have been dormant in the ice for millennia but are still viable when thawed. The scientific community celebrates these discoveries as windows into the prehistoric past, but Etienne and I know that they are something much more dangerous. Every few years, Etienne calls me with news of some new discovery in the permafrost, some new creature or organism that has been found in the melting ground. His voice always carries the same undertone of concern, the same awareness that we are witnessing the early stages of something that could be catastrophic. He has tried to raise concerns within the scientific community about the potential dangers of permafrost thaw, but his warnings are dismissed as overly cautious or sensationalistic. To this day, I believe that the creature we encountered in Mayo River that night was some kind of guardian or sentinel, something that had been watching over the frozen ground for thousands of years and maintaining the balance between the living world and the things that were meant to stay buried. Its warning was not just about climate change or environmental destruction, but about something much more fundamental and terrifying. The permafrost is not just a layer of frozen soil. It is a prison, and the locks are melting. My grandfather Henri Gagnon was a hunting guide in the Yukon for over 40 years. In 1987, he took a group of hunters up Keno Hill, who would never make it back down. By that time, Grandpère had guided hundreds of hunting expeditions through the remote wilderness areas around the historic silver mining district, and he knew every game trail, every creek crossing, and every dangerous ravine between Mayo and the old mining camps. His reputation for bringing hunters safely back home while helping them bag trophy moose and caribou had spread across Canada and even into the United States. People would book hunting trips with Henri Gagnon 2 or 3 years in advance, knowing that a week in the Yukon wilderness with him was going to be the hunting adventure of a lifetime. My name is Gabriel Fournier, and I am telling you about what happened to my grandfather, because the official records do not tell the whole story. The RCMP investigation concluded that 4 experienced hunters from Ontario died in an accidental fall down an abandoned mine shaft on Keno Hill. But that explanation has never made sense to anyone who knew the men involved or understood the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. Graham Pear never spoke publicly about what he witnessed during those terrible days in October of 1987. But he told me the truth on his deathbed in 2003, and I believe that people deserve to know what really happened up there in the old silver mining country. The 4 hunters were all from the Toronto area, successful businessmen in their 40s and 50s who had been coming to the Yukon together for hunting trips for over a decade. Richard Lamont was a real estate developer who owned half of downtown Mississauga. Thomas Brennan was a construction company owner who had worked on some of the biggest projects in Ontario. David McLeod was a successful accountant who handled finances for several major corporations. And their group leader was William Sinclair, retired military officer who had served in Korea and was known for his meticulous planning and attention to detail. These were not weekend warriors or inexperienced city hunters trying to play at being outdoorsmen. They were serious, competent men who had spent weeks every year for the past 10 years hunting in remote areas of northern Canada. Graham Pear had guided this same group of 4 hunters on 3 previous occasions, and he considered them to be among his most reliable clients. They always followed his instructions exactly, never wandered away from camp without permission, and had enough wilderness experience to be genuinely helpful, rather than just extra baggage that needed to be looked after. When they booked their 1987 hunting trip, they specifically requested to hunt in the area around Keno Hill, even though Graham Pear had warned them that the terrain there was more challenging and potentially dangerous than their usual hunting grounds. The old silver mining district was riddled with abandoned mine shafts, some of them partially collapsed and hidden by decades of vegetation growth, making it treacherous country for anyone who was not extremely careful about where they walked. But the hunters were confident in their abilities, and they were particularly interested in the Keno Hill area because it was known for having some of the largest moose and caribou in the territory. The high elevation and remote location meant that the game animals in that region were less pressured by hunting than those in more accessible areas, and trophy-class bulls were more common there than anywhere else Graham Pear had ever guided. After some discussion, he agreed to take them up to Keno Hill for a week-long expedition, with the understanding that they would have to be even more cautious than usual and follow his safety protocols without question. They established their base camp in a sheltered valley about 5 kilometers southwest of the old Keno Hill mining complex, far enough away from the abandoned shafts and industrial debris to be safe, but close enough to hunt the prime moose habitat that surrounded the mining district. The area had not been actively mined since United Keno. Hill Mines had shut down operations in 1989, but there were still plenty of visible reminders of the mining era scattered across the landscape. Rusted machinery, collapsed buildings, piles of waste rock, and of course, the mine shafts themselves, some of them hundreds of feet deep, and all of them deadly traps for anyone unfortunate enough to fall into them. For the first 2 days of the hunting trip, everything went exactly according to plan. The weather was perfect for hunting, with cool temperatures and light snow that made tracking easier. The hunters were in good spirits and following all of Graham Pear's safety guidelines. On Tuesday, Thomas Brennan shot a magnificent bull moose with a rack that would have been the envy of hunters across North America. On Wednesday, David McLeod took a trophy caribou that dressed out at over 400 pounds. By Thursday morning, all 4 men were confident that this was going to be one of their most successful hunting trips ever. That was when things began to go wrong in ways that defied all logical explanation. Graham Pear woke up on Thursday morning to discover that all 4 hunters were missing from their tents. Not just absent, but completely gone, with their sleeping bags still warm and their personal belongings still inside their tents exactly as they had been arranged the night before. Their hunting rifles were still in the tent, propped against the tent walls where they always kept them at night. Their heavy winter clothing was still there, hanging on the makeshift clotheslines they had strung up to dry their gear. Even their boots were still sitting outside their tent flaps, which meant that all 4 men had walked away from camp in the middle of the night wearing nothing but their long underwear and socks. Grandpère called out for them, thinking that perhaps they had all gotten up early to use the latrine area that he had established about 50 meters from camp. When he received no response, he systematically searched the entire area around their base camp, looking for any sign of where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. What he found made no sense at all. There were footprints leading away from the camp, clearly made by 4 different men walking barefoot through the snow. But the tracks were wrong in ways that he still struggled to describe, even years later when he told me about it. The footprints were the right size and shape to have been made by the 4 missing hunters, but they showed no signs of the hesitation or careful stepping that would be expected from men walking barefoot through snow in sub-zero temperatures. Instead, the tracks showed a steady, purposeful stride, as if the men were completely comfortable walking without shoes across terrain that should have been painfully cold and difficult to navigate. Even more disturbing, the tracks were perfectly spaced and aligned, as if all 4 men had been walking in single file with exactly the same stride length and pace. Grandpère had tracked thousands of animals and hundreds of people during his decades as a guide, but he had never seen human tracks that showed such unnatural uniformity. He followed the trail for over 2 kilometers, through dense forest and across rocky terrain that would have been treacherous for anyone walking in bare feet. The tracks led directly toward the old Keno Hill mining complex, winding through the abandoned industrial area with the same steady, purposeful pace that they had maintained since leaving the camp. Grandpère began to feel genuinely frightened as he realized that the trail was leading directly toward some of the deepest and most dangerous mine shafts in the entire district. These were not the smaller prospect holes that dotted the landscape throughout the mining country, but the major production shafts that dropped straight down for hundreds of feet into the earth. When he finally caught up with the 4 hunters, what he saw convinced him that he was witnessing something that had no place in the natural world. Richard, Thomas, David, and William were standing in a perfect circle around the opening of the Ladue shaft, one of the deepest mine shafts in the Keno Hill district. They were motionless, staring straight down into the darkness below, and they had apparently been standing there for hours. Their feet and legs were blue with cold, and ice crystals had formed in their hair and on their skin, but they showed no signs of discomfort or awareness of their surroundings. When Grandpère called out to them, none of them responded or even acknowledged his presence. He approached them carefully, not sure what was happening, but increasingly certain that something was very wrong with the situation. As he got closer, he could see that their eyes were wide open but completely unfocused, as if they were looking at something far away, rather than the mine shaft directly in front of them. Their breathing was slow and shallow, almost like they were in some kind of trance or deeply meditative state. Most disturbing of all, they were all breathing in perfect synchronization, inhaling and exhaling at exactly the same time, as if they were sharing a single set of lungs. Grandpère tried shaking them, shouting at them, even slapping their faces, but nothing he did could break them out of whatever state they were in. They remained perfectly still, staring down into the mine shaft with that same blank, unfocused expression. After about 10 minutes of trying to rouse them, he made the decision to hike back to camp and get the emergency radio to call for help. He knew that the hunters were in immediate danger from hypothermia, and whatever was wrong with them was clearly beyond his ability to handle alone. The hike back to camp and the radio call to the RCMP took approximately 2 hours. Grandpère explained the situation as clearly as he could, though he knew that his account of 4 men standing motionless around a mine shaft in their underwear sounded impossible to believe. The dispatcher assured him that a rescue helicopter would be dispatched immediately, and that a full search and rescue team would be mobilized to assist with whatever medical emergency was occurring. But when Grandpere led the RCMP officers and paramedics back to the Ladue shaft 3 hours later, the 4 hunters were no longer standing around the opening. They were at the bottom of the shaft, more than 300 feet below ground level, all 4 of them dead from injuries consistent with having fallen from a great height. The rescue team spent 2 days recovering the bodies using specialized mining equipment and experienced cave rescue personnel. The official investigation concluded that the men had somehow fallen into the mine shaft, possibly while investigating the opening out of curiosity, and that their deaths were accidental. Grandpere never accepted that explanation, and neither do I. Men do not accidentally fall into mine shafts while standing around the perimeter in a perfect circle. They certainly do not all fall at exactly the same time, and they do not walk 2 kilometers through snow in bare feet to reach a mine shaft unless something is compelling them to do so. The RCMP investigators were good people doing their best to make sense of a situation that had no rational explanation, but they were not willing to consider possibilities that fell outside the boundaries of normal human experience. In the years that followed, Grandpere quietly researched the history of the Keno Hill mining district, particularly focusing on accidents and unusual incidents that had occurred during the active mining years. What he discovered was a pattern of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths that stretched back to the very beginning of mining operations in the area. Workers who had walked away from their jobs in the middle of their shifts and were later found dead at the bottom of mine shafts. Entire work crews who had vanished overnight, leaving behind their tools and personal belongings. Miners who had reported hearing voices calling to them from the depths of the shafts, voices that spoke in languages they did not recognize but somehow understood. The mining companies had covered up these incidents, either by bribing the authorities or by simply not reporting them at all. Dead miners were bad for business, and unexplained deaths were even worse. It was easier to list missing workers as having quit their jobs and moved on to other mining camps than to acknowledge that something in the Keno Hill district was systematically killing people. Grandpere estimated that over the 70 years of active mining in the area, at least 50 people had died under circumstances similar to what happened to the 4 hunters from Ontario. After Grandpere told me this story in 2003, I began conducting my own research into the history of the Keno Hill area. What I have discovered suggests that whatever killed those 4 hunters in 1987 is still active today, still calling people to the mine shafts, still compelling them to walk barefoot through the snow to their deaths. Modern mining operations in the district have reported workers going missing, security cameras capturing footage of people walking toward the old mine shafts with the same purposeful synchronized gait that Grandpere described. The mining companies do not publicize these incidents, but the information is available if you know where to look for it. I believe that something lives in the depths of the Keno Hill mine shafts, something that was disturbed when the miners first broke through into the deep underground chambers where it had been sleeping for thousands of years. It feeds on human life, drawing people to the mine shafts through some form of mental compulsion that overrides their survival instincts and reduces them to mindless automatons. The 4 hunters from Ontario were just the latest victims in a pattern of predation that has been continuing for over a century. Grandpere stopped guiding hunters in the Keno Hill area after 1987, and he spent the rest of his career warning other guides and outfitters to stay away from the old mining district. Most of them listened to him, but some did not. And every few years, there would be another hunting accident. Another group of hunters found at the bottom of a mine shaft with no explanation for how they had gotten there. The pattern continues today, and it will continue until someone finds a way to destroy whatever is living in those deep, dark holes in the ground. My name is Robert Sinclair, and I was a forensic investigator for the Yukon Territory. In 1992, we investigated a series of disappearances that led us to the most disturbing crime scene I had ever encountered in my 23 years of law enforcement. What started as routine missing persons reports from various mining operations around Whitehorse eventually uncovered a level of depravity that still haunts me today. More than 30 years after the investigation concluded, some cases you can put behind you when the paperwork is filed and the courtroom doors close, but this is not one of them. This case changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and the capacity for evil that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. During the summer and fall of 1992, 6 transient workers from various mining operations vanished without trace in and around Whitehorse. These were not the kind of disappearances that typically generated much attention from law enforcement or the media. The men who went missing were seasonal laborers, drifters who moved from one mining camp to another following the work, men without permanent addresses or close family ties, who might notice immediately when they failed to come home. In the mining industry, it was common for workers to simply quit their jobs without notice and move on to better opportunities elsewhere. Foremen and company managers were accustomed to high turnover rates, especially among the temporary workers who did the most dangerous and lowest paid jobs. The first disappearance was reported in June when Marcel Dupuis, a 28-year-old equipment operator from Quebec, failed to show up for his shift at a placer mining operation south of Whitehorse. His supervisor assumed that Marcel had quit and moved on to another job, which would have been perfectly normal behavior for a transient worker. It was not until 2 weeks later, when Marcel's final paycheck remained unclaimed at the company office, that anyone began to suspect something might be wrong. Even then, the mining company did not report him as a missing person. They simply mailed his paycheck to the last address he had provided, which turned out to be a rooming house in Vancouver, where Marcel had not lived for over a year. The second disappearance occurred in July when André Lavoie, a 34-year-old heavy equipment mechanic from New Brunswick, vanished from a gold mining operation near Mount Sema. André had been working for the same company for 3 months, which made him practically a long-term employee by the standards of seasonal mining work. He was reliable, competent, and well-liked by his fellow workers. When he failed to report for his Monday morning shift, his foreman initially assumed that André had gotten drunk over the weekend and was sleeping off a hangover. But when André failed to appear for the entire week and did not respond to messages left at the rooming house where he was staying, the company began to worry that he might have had an accident or medical emergency. The pattern continued through the summer and into the fall. François Bélanger disappeared from a mining camp near Carmax in August. Pierre Gagnon vanished from a construction site in Riverdale in September. Louis Caron went missing from a mining operation near Brayburn in early October. Each disappearance followed the same basic pattern. A transient worker would simply fail to show up for work one day and would never be seen again. Their personal belongings would be left behind in their accommodations, their paychecks would go unclaimed, and there would be no indication of where they had gone or why they had left. By October of 1992, even the most skeptical mining foremen were beginning to realize that something unusual was happening. 5 men disappearing over a period of 4 months might have been a statistical coincidence, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. All of the missing men were French-Canadian. All of them were between the ages of 25 and 40. All of them were single with no permanent ties to the Yukon, and all of them had vanished without taking their personal belongings or collecting their final paychecks. More disturbing still, none of the missing men had been seen leaving their work sites or accommodations. They had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. The RCMP opened a formal investigation in November 1992, and I was assigned as the lead investigator due to my experience with missing persons cases and violent crime. My first step was to interview the supervisors, co-workers, and acquaintances of each missing man to determine if there were any common connections between them. What I discovered was that all 5 men had frequented the same tavern in downtown Whitehorse. a rough working-class bar called the Northern Lights that catered specifically to miners, construction workers, and other transient laborers. More significantly, several witnesses reported seeing the missing men talking to the same individual on multiple occasions, a middle-aged man named Douglas MacLeod, who worked as an equipment supplier for various mining operations throughout the territory. Douglas MacLeod was a well-known figure in the Yukon mining community. He had moved to Whitehorse from Saskatchewan in 1985 and had built a successful business supplying mining equipment, tools, and machinery parts to operations throughout the territory. He was considered to be a reliable businessman who provided good service at competitive prices, and he had developed relationships with most of the major mining companies in the region. MacLeod was also known to frequent the Northern Lights Tavern, where he often bought drinks for miners and construction workers while discussing business opportunities and job openings at various sites. Several witnesses told me that they had seen MacLeod talking to each of the missing men in the weeks before their disappearances. The conversations always followed a similar pattern. MacLeod would approach a worker who appeared to be between jobs or dissatisfied with their current employment situation, and he would mention that he knew of better opportunities at remote mining sites that needed experienced workers. He would offer to provide transportation to these job sites, claiming that the mining companies would reimburse him for the travel expenses once the workers were hired. To men who were struggling financially or looking for better paying work, these offers were extremely attractive. Based on this information, I obtained a search warrant for MacLeod's business premises and residence. What we found there was the most horrifying crime scene I had ever encountered in my career. MacLeod lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of Whitehorse, situated on 10 acres of heavily wooded property that provided complete privacy from neighbors and passing traffic. The house itself appeared normal from the outside, a typical 2-story log construction that would not have attracted any unusual attention. But the basement had been converted into something that belonged in a horror movie rather than a residential home. The basement contained a fully equipped butcher shop, complete with industrial meat processing equipment, refrigeration units, and specialized tools for cutting and preparing animal carcasses, except that the evidence clearly indicated that this equipment had not been used for processing animals. Human remains were found in the industrial freezers, carefully packaged and labeled with dates and what appeared to be cooking instructions. The cutting tables showed traces of human blood and tissue, and the specialized knives and saws had been used to dismember human bodies with the same precision and efficiency that would be expected from a professional butcher. Most disturbing of all, we found a detailed journal that MacLeod had been keeping, documenting his activities with the same meticulous attention to detail that he applied to his business operations. The journal entries described how he would identify potential victims at the Northern Lights Tavern, approach them with offers of employment, and lure them to his property under the pretext of providing transportation to remote job sites. Once the victims were in his house, MacLeod would drug them, kill them, and then process their bodies using the industrial equipment in his basement. The journal made it clear that MacLeod was not just a serial killer, but also a cannibal who had been consuming portions of his victims and preserving other portions for future consumption. The investigation revealed that MacLeod had been operating for at least 3 years before we caught him, and that the 5 men who had disappeared in 1992 were just the most recent victims in a much longer series of murders. The journal entries and physical evidence suggested that MacLeod had killed at least 12 people, all of them transient, workers who fit the same basic profile as the 1992 victims. The remote location of his property, combined with his reputation as a respected businessman, had provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. Douglas MacLeod was arrested without incident at his business office in downtown Whitehorse. He made no attempt to resist arrest or deny the charges, and he cooperated fully with investigators throughout the interrogation process. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that his activities had finally been discovered, as if the burden of maintaining his double life had become too exhausting to continue. He provided detailed confessions for all of the murders and even assisted investigators in locating additional human remains that had been buried on his property. McLeod was convicted on 12 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at a maximum security facility in British Columbia, where he was expected to spend the remainder of his life. However, McLeod died of an apparent heart attack in 1995, just 3 years after his conviction. His death meant that several aspects of the case were never fully resolved, particularly the exact number of victims and the locations of all the human remains. The investigation also revealed that McLeod had been selling processed meat to several restaurants and food service operations in Whitehorse, claiming that it was wild game such as moose, caribou, and deer. Laboratory analysis confirmed that at least some of this meat had been human flesh, meaning that an unknown number of people in Whitehorse had unknowingly consumed portions of McLeod's victims. This information was never released to the public, as authorities determined that it would cause unnecessary panic and trauma without serving any useful purpose. The Northern Lights Tavern closed permanently 6 months after McLeod's arrest, not because of any official action, but because the business could not survive the association with the crimes. The building stood empty for several years before being demolished and replaced with a parking lot. McLeod's house and property were seized by the territorial government and have remained vacant ever since, despite several attempts to sell or redevelop the land. Local residents report that the property has an unsettling atmosphere that makes it impossible to use for any normal purpose. To this day, the McLeod case remains the most disturbing criminal investigation in Yukon territorial history. The systematic nature of the murders, combined with the cannibalistic elements and the fact that McLeod had been operating undetected for years, challenged every assumption that law enforcement had about the nature of violent crime in small, isolated communities. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of transient workers who had no permanent connections to the communities where they worked, making them perfect targets for predators who understood how to exploit their circumstances. Even now, more than 30 years after the investigation concluded, I still receive calls from law enforcement agencies across Canada asking for advice on similar cases involving missing transient workers. The McLeod investigation established protocols for tracking and investigating disappearances among seasonal laborers that are still used today. But more than anything else, the case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear most normal and trustworthy, the ones who integrate themselves so thoroughly into their communities that no one suspects what they are capable of doing. When I was 28 years old, my wife Marianne and I bought a cabin on Lake LaBerge. We thought we had found paradise until we learned why the previous owners left so suddenly. This was back in March of 1994, and we had been living in Vancouver for nearly 5 years, working demanding jobs in the tech industry that left us exhausted and stressed most of the time. The idea of owning a remote cabin in the Yukon, where we could escape for weekends and holidays, seemed like the perfect solution to the burnout we were both experiencing. Lake LaBerge was exactly what we had been dreaming about. Pristine wilderness, crystal clear water, and absolute silence except for the sounds of nature. My name is Philippe Arsenault, and I need to tell you about what happened during our first winter at the cabin, because it changed everything we thought we knew about the natural world. The property we purchased was located on the eastern shore of Lake LaBerge, about 50 kilometers north of Whitehorse, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that was frequently impassable during the winter months. The cabin itself was a beautiful log structure built in the 1970s by a mining engineer who had wanted a quiet retreat where he could fish and hunt during his time off. The previous owners, a retired couple from Calgary, had owned the property for nearly 15 years before deciding to sell it suddenly and move back to Alberta. When we first viewed the cabin, The real estate agent mentioned that the previous owners had been very motivated to sell quickly, accepting our first offer without negotiation, despite the fact that similar properties in the area typically stayed on the market for months or even years. At the time, we assumed that they simply needed to liquidate their assets quickly for financial reasons, which was not uncommon among retirees living on fixed incomes. The agent also mentioned that the previous owners had left behind most of the furniture and equipment, including a generator, propane appliances, and even a small aluminum boat with an outboard motor. Again, we interpreted this as evidence that they needed to make a quick sale rather than as a warning sign that something might be wrong with the property. The local residents in Braeburn, the closest community to our cabin, were polite but somewhat evasive when we introduced ourselves and mentioned that we had purchased the Lake LaBerge property. Several people made vague comments about the previous owners being fine people who kept to themselves, but no one would provide any specific information about why they had left so suddenly. One elderly man at the general store mentioned that the previous owners had been regular customers for over a decade, then had stopped coming to town completely during their final year at the cabin. When we asked if he knew why they had left, he just shrugged and changed the subject to the weather forecast. For the first 8 months of ownership, we used the cabin exactly as we had planned, driving up from Vancouver every few weeks for long weekends of hiking, fishing, and relaxation. The property was everything we had hoped it would be: peaceful, beautiful, and completely isolated from the pressures of city life. Lake LaBerge was perfect for canoeing and fishing during the summer months, and the surrounding forest provided excellent opportunities for wildlife observation and photography. We saw moose, caribou, black bears, and dozens of bird species that we had only read about in nature guides. The cabin was comfortable and well maintained, with a stone fireplace that kept the interior warm even during the coldest nights. Everything changed during our first extended stay in December of 1994, when we decided to spend 2 weeks at the cabin during the Christmas holidays. This was the first time we had been there during the deep winter months, when the lake was completely frozen and the daylight hours were reduced to just a few hours of dim twilight. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the snow was deep enough to make the access road completely impassable without snowshoes or a snowmobile. We had prepared for these conditions, bringing enough food and fuel to last for 3 weeks, if necessary, and we were looking forward to experiencing the Yukon winter in all its harsh beauty. On our third night at the cabin, December 23rd, Marianne woke me up around midnight to point out strange blue lights that were visible through our bedroom window. At first, I thought she was seeing the aurora borealis, which would not have been unusual at our latitude during the winter months. But when I looked outside, it was immediately apparent that these lights were nothing like the northern lights that we had seen on previous visits. Instead of the dancing, shimmering curtains of light that characterized the aurora, these were distinct points of blue light that appeared to be moving beneath the surface of the frozen lake. From our bedroom window, we could see approximately a dozen individual lights, each about the size and brightness of a streetlight, distributed across the portion of the lake that was visible from our cabin. The lights were clearly underwater, shining up through what had to be at least 3 feet of solid ice, but somehow they were bright enough to illuminate the snow-covered surface above them. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, sometimes individually and sometimes in small groups, as if they were being controlled by some kind of intelligence rather than drifting randomly with underwater currents. We watched the lights for about an hour, fascinated and increasingly puzzled by what we were seeing. Neither of us had any scientific explanation for underwater lights that could penetrate solid ice, especially lights that moved in such organized patterns. I considered the possibility that they might be some kind of bioluminescent organisms, but I had never heard of any freshwater species that could produce that kind of sustained bright light. Marianne suggested that they might be artificial lights from some kind of underwater research equipment, but Lake LaBerge was far too remote and inaccessible to support that kind of scientific operation, especially during the winter months. The next morning, we snowshoed out onto the frozen lake to investigate the area where we had seen the lights. The ice was solid and thick, showing no signs of recent disturbance or unusual activity. There were no holes, cracks, or thin spots that might have explained how lights could penetrate from below. The snow on the surface was unmarked except for animal tracks, mostly rabbits and ptarmigan, with no indication that anyone else had been in the area recently. We spent several hours examining different portions of the lake, but found no physical evidence that could explain the mysterious lights. The lights appeared again on the following night, December 24th, and this time they were significantly brighter and more active. Instead of the slow, random movements we had observed the night before, the lights began forming geometric patterns beneath the ice. Triangles, squares, and more complex shapes appeared and dissolved as the lights moved into different configurations. The patterns were too precise and deliberate to be random, clearly indicating some form of purposeful intelligence behind their movements. Most disturbing of all, some of the patterns resembled letters and numbers, as if whatever was controlling the lights was attempting to communicate with us. On Christmas morning, Marianne discovered that the lights had left physical marks on the surface of the lake. The geometric patterns that we had seen the night before were now etched into the ice itself, burned or melted into the surface, with precision that would have been impossible to achieve using any normal means. The lines were perfectly straight, and the curves were geometrically perfect, as if they had been created using sophisticated equipment rather than natural processes. The marks were approximately 3 inches deep and showed no signs of refreezing, suggesting that whatever had created them had generated intense heat. Over the following week, the lights became increasingly active, and the patterns they created became more complex and recognizable. By New Year's Eve, we realized that the lights were spelling out names and dates in the ice. Not random names, but specific names that we later discovered belonged to people who had drowned in Lake LaBerge during the past several decades. Sarah Mackenzie, 1973. Robert Wilson, 1981. Jennifer Lavoie, 1987. Marie Gagnon, 1990. Each name was accompanied by a date that corresponded to documented drowning incidents that had occurred in the lake over the past 20 years. The implications of what we were witnessing were terrifying. These were not natural phenomena or scientific anomalies, but some form of supernatural communication from people who had died in the lake. The precision and intelligence behind the light patterns suggested that the spirits of the drowning victims were somehow trapped beneath the ice, trying to communicate with the living world. The previous owners of the cabin had obviously experienced the same phenomena, which explained their sudden decision to sell the property and leave the area permanently. On January 2nd, the lights began spelling out specific requests rather than just names and dates. "Find my body," appeared in the ice near the shore. "Tell my family what happened. Help us rest." The messages became increasingly desperate and emotional, with phrases like, "Please do not ignore us," and "We have been waiting so long," burned into the surface of the lake. It became clear that the spirits were not just trying to communicate, but were actively seeking help from the living to resolve their unfinished business. Marianne and I spent the remainder of our stay researching the drowning incidents that the spirits had identified. Using the cabin's radio telephone, we contacted the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse and requested information about the missing persons cases associated with Lake LaBerge. What we learned was deeply disturbing. 5 people had drowned in the lake over the past 20 years, but only 2 of the bodies had ever been recovered. The other 3 victims, Sarah Mackenzie, Marie Gagnon, and Jennifer Lavoie, had simply vanished beneath the surface, leaving behind grieving families who had never received closure about what happened to their loved ones. Following the guidance provided by the spirits through their light patterns, we were able to determine the approximate locations where the missing bodies had come to rest on the bottom of the lake. The lights would congregate in specific areas, forming bright clusters that clearly indicated the locations of the remains. Using a GPS device, we recorded the coordinates of these locations and provided the information to the RCMP when we returned to Whitehorse in mid-January. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police initially expressed skepticism about our account of supernatural communication through underwater lights, but they agreed to investigate the locations we had identified once the lake thawed sufficiently to allow diving operations. In May of 1995, professional divers working under RCMP supervision recovered the remains of all 3 missing drowning victims from the exact locations that the spirits had indicated. The families of Sarah Mackenzie, Marie Gagnon, and Jennifer Lavoie were finally able to hold proper burial services for their loved ones, bringing closure to cases that had remained unsolved for years. After the bodies were recovered and properly buried, the lights beneath Lake LaBerge disappeared completely. We returned to the cabin several times during the summer of 1995, but never again observed any unusual phenomena. The lake returned to its natural state, appearing no different from thousands of other pristine wilderness lakes throughout the Yukon Territory. The spirits had apparently found the peace they had been seeking and no longer needed to communicate with the living world. We sold the Lake LaBerge cabin in the fall of 1995, not because we were afraid of the supernatural activity, but because we realized that our purpose there had been fulfilled. We had been chosen, for reasons we still do not understand, to serve as intermediaries between the spirit world and the living world, helping trapped souls find peace and providing closure to grieving families. The experience changed our entire understanding of life, death, and the connections that exist between the physical and spiritual realms. To this day, I believe that certain locations, particularly those associated with sudden or traumatic deaths, can serve as bridges between different planes of existence. Lake LaBerge was one such place, where the boundary between life and death had become permeable, allowing communication between spirits and living people under the right circumstances. The lights were not a supernatural threat, but rather a desperate attempt by trapped souls to complete their unfinished business and find the rest that had been denied to them by their sudden, unexpected deaths beneath the frozen surface of the lake. My name is Michelle Tremblay, and I coordinate search and rescue operations out of Dawson City. In 2003, we received a distress call that led to one of our strangest cases. I have been working in emergency response services for nearly 15 years, and in that time I have dealt with everything from mining accidents to aircraft crashes to hunters who got lost in the wilderness during blizzards. The Yukon is a harsh and unforgiving place, where a small mistake or a moment of bad luck can quickly become a life or death situation. Most of the calls we receive follow predictable patterns, with outcomes that make sense even when they are tragic. But there are some cases that defy all logical explanation, cases that challenge everything you think you know about the natural world and human behavior. The incident I am about to describe occurred in late August of 2003, during what should have been perfect weather for outdoor research activities. A team of 3 geologists from the University of British Columbia had been conducting mineral surveys in the Ogilvy Mountains, a remote range located about 200 kilometers northeast of Dawson City, near the Arctic Circle. The team consisted of Dr. James Sinclair, a 45-year-old professor of geology who had been leading field research expeditions for over 20 years, Dr. Sarah McLeod, a 32-year-old specialist in mineral exploration who had worked throughout northern Canada, and Martin Dubois, a 26-year-old graduate student who was completing his master's degree in geological sciences. The research project was funded by the Canadian Geological Survey and focused on identifying potential rare earth mineral deposits in areas that had not been thoroughly explored during previous geological surveys. The Ogilvy Mountains were particularly interesting because they contained rock formations that were similar to those found in other locations where valuable mineral deposits had been discovered. The team was equipped with sophisticated geological instruments, satellite communication equipment, and enough supplies to sustain them for 2 weeks in the remote wilderness. They had filed detailed itineraries with both their university and our Search and Rescue Coordination Center, including specific coordinates for their research sites and scheduled check-in times. Dr. Sinclair was an experienced wilderness researcher who had led dozens of similar expeditions throughout the Canadian Arctic. He was known for his meticulous attention to safety protocols and his insistence that his team members follow established procedures for remote area research. Dr. McLeod had worked in isolated locations throughout northern British Columbia and the Northwest Territories, and she was considered to be one of the most competent field researchers in her department. Martin Dubois was relatively inexperienced in remote wilderness work, but he had been carefully selected for the expedition because of his technical expertise and his demonstrated ability to follow instructions precisely. The team established their base camp on August 22nd at coordinates that placed them in a broad valley surrounded by peaks that rose to elevations of over 2,000 meters above sea level. The location provided good access to the specific rock formations they wanted to study, while also offering shelter from the wind and proximity to a reliable water source. They were equipped with a high-frequency radio system that allowed them to communicate with our coordination center twice daily at 0800 hours and 1800 hours, providing updates on their research progress and confirming that all team members were healthy and safe. For the first 4 days of their expedition, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. The team made their scheduled radio contacts on time, reported that their research was progressing well, and indicated that they had not encountered any problems or safety concerns. Dr. Sinclair's reports were professional and detailed, describing the geological samples they had collected, the measurements they had taken, and their plans for the following day's activities. The weather in the area was excellent, with clear skies, moderate temperatures, and no precipitation that would have interfered with their fieldwork. Their final scheduled radio contact occurred on the evening of August 26th, when Dr. Sinclair reported that they had completed their mineral surveys in the immediate area of their base camp and were planning to spend the following day collecting additional samples from a ridge system located approximately 3 kilometers to the northwest. He indicated that all 3 team members were in good health, that their equipment was functioning properly, and that they had sufficient food and fuel to complete their research as planned. The radio contact was clear and routine, with no indication of any problems or concerns. When the team failed to make their scheduled radio contact on the morning of August 27th, our coordination center immediately attempted to re-establish communication. Emergency protocols required that research teams make contact within 1 hour of their scheduled check-in time, and failure to do so triggers an automatic response sequence. We made repeated attempts to raise the team on both their primary and backup radio frequencies throughout the morning of August 27th, but received no response from their camp. By noon, we had activated our emergency response procedures and began preparations for a search and rescue mission. A helicopter equipped with search and rescue personnel was dispatched to the team's last known location on the afternoon of August 27th. The flight to their base camp took approximately 90 minutes, crossing some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in the Yukon Territory. When our helicopter arrived at the coordinates that Dr. Sinclair had provided for their base camp, the search team immediately identified the research site and confirmed that the geologists' equipment and supplies were still there, but there were no signs of the 3 researchers themselves. What our search team found at the base camp was both puzzling and disturbing. All 3 tents were still standing and appeared to be in perfect condition, with no signs of damage from weather or animals. The team's equipment was neatly arranged around the campsite exactly as it would be expected to appear during normal research activities. Their geological instruments were still running, continuing to collect data as they had been programmed to do. Meals that appeared to have been in the process of being prepared were sitting on their camp stove, with utensils and dishes arranged as if the researchers had simply stepped away for a few minutes. Personal belongings were found inside each tent, carefully organized and showing no signs of hasty packing or emergency departure. Sleeping bags were unzipped and arranged as if they had been recently slept in. Clothing was hung on makeshift clotheslines to dry. Field notebooks containing detailed research data were sitting open on camp tables, with entries dated August 26th that described the geological work the team had completed that day. Most significantly, the team's emergency radio equipment was still functioning and had been left in the on position, meaning they should have been able to respond to our repeated attempts to contact them. Our helicopter search team conducted aerial reconnaissance of the entire area surrounding the base camp, covering approximately 100 square kilometers of mountainous terrain. They searched every ridge, valley, creek bed, and open area within walking distance of the camp, looking for any signs of the missing researchers. Ground teams were inserted at multiple locations to conduct more detailed searches of areas that could not be adequately examined from the air. The search effort continued for 3 days, involving 2 helicopters, 12 ground personnel, and specialized search dogs trained to locate missing persons. On August 30th, exactly 5 days after they had missed their scheduled radio contact, the 3 researchers were discovered by one of our helicopter teams. They were found walking in slow, deliberate circles around their base camp, approximately 50 meters from their tents, moving in a pattern that formed a perfect circle with a diameter of about 20 meters. All 3 were suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, despite the fact that the weather had been relatively warm during their disappearance and they had access to adequate food and water at their campsite. When our rescue personnel approached the researchers, they showed no recognition of the helicopter or the search team members. They continued walking in their circular pattern, staring straight ahead with blank expressions, apparently unaware of their surroundings or their condition. They did not respond to verbal commands, physical contact, or medical examination. Their movements were mechanical and synchronized, as if they were all following the same invisible set of instructions. Most disturbing of all, they had been walking in this circular pattern long enough to wear a clearly visible path into the ground, suggesting that they had been engaged in this behavior for days. All 3 researchers were immediately evacuated to the hospital in Whitehorse for medical evaluation and treatment. Physical examinations revealed that they were suffering from exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion consistent with having spent several days outdoors without adequate food, water, or shelter. However, there were no signs of injury, illness, or drug intoxication that could explain their bizarre behavior or their apparent amnesia about what had happened to them during the 5 days they were missing. Psychological evaluations conducted over the following weeks revealed that all 3 researchers had complete memory loss regarding the period from the evening of August 26th until they were found by our search team on August 30th. Dr. Sinclair, Dr. McLeod, and Martin Dubois all remembered making their final radio contact on the evening of August 26th and discussing their plans for the following day. But they had no recollection of anything that happened after that point until they found themselves in the hospital in Whitehorse. Medical tests, including brain scans and blood work, revealed no abnormalities that could account for their memory loss or their strange behavior. The researchers were kept under observation for 2 weeks, while medical personnel attempted to determine what had happened to them and whether their condition posed any ongoing health risks. During this time, they gradually recovered their normal mental faculties and were able to resume their regular activities. However, their memory loss regarding the 5 missing days remained complete and permanent. No amount of medical treatment, psychological therapy, or hypnosis could restore any recollection of what they had experienced during their disappearance. All three researchers resigned from the University of British Columbia immediately upon their release from the hospital. Dr. Sinclair retired from academic life entirely and moved to a small farming community in southern Ontario, where he now works as a high school science teacher. Dr. McLeod accepted a position with a private consulting company that specializes in urban development projects, ensuring that she would never again have to work in remote wilderness areas. Martin Dubois abandoned his graduate studies in geology and enrolled in law school, pursuing a career that would keep him safely confined to offices and courtrooms. None of the three researchers has ever been willing to discuss the incident publicly, and all of them have declined requests for interviews from journalists, researchers, and other scientists who are interested in understanding what happened to them. The official investigation conducted by the RCMP and university officials concluded that the researchers had suffered some form of collective psychological episode, possibly triggered by stress, isolation, or environmental factors, but no specific cause was ever identified. The research site in the Ogilvy Mountains was quietly abandoned after the incident. The University of British Columbia canceled all future geological survey projects in that area, citing safety concerns and budget constraints. The Canadian Geological Survey removed the location from their list of priority research areas, and no subsequent scientific expeditions have been authorized for that region. The base camp equipment and geological samples collected by the team were recovered by helicopter and returned to the university, but the research data was never analyzed or published. To this day, the case remains one of the most puzzling incidents our Search and Rescue Coordination Center has ever dealt with. Three experienced, competent researchers simply vanished for 5 days, leaving behind a perfectly intact camp with running equipment and half-prepared meals, only to be found walking in circles with complete memory loss about their experience. No conventional explanation has ever been found for their disappearance, their condition when they were discovered, or their permanent amnesia about the incident. I believe that something in those remote mountains affected the researchers in ways that our medical and scientific knowledge cannot adequately explain. Whether it was some form of environmental toxin, electromagnetic phenomenon, or something even more unusual, it created a situation that was beyond the normal parameters of human experience. The fact that all three researchers immediately left their careers and refused to return to remote wilderness areas suggests that on some level, even though they could not consciously remember what happened, they retained an instinctive fear of encountering it again. When I was 19, I worked at the gas station in Carmacks. It was a quiet job until the day a customer walked in covered in blood, claiming he had been attacked by a hitchhiker. My name is Jean-Paul Dubois, and I need to tell you about what happened during the summer of 1998, because it was the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Yukon Territory history. At the time, I was just a kid trying to earn money for college, working the night shift at the only gas station in Carmacks, a small community of about 500 people located on the banks of the Yukon River. It was the kind of job where nothing ever happened, where the biggest excitement was usually a tourist asking for directions or a trucker stopping for coffee and fuel on his way to Alaska. Carmacks sits at the junction of the Klondike Highway and the Robert Campbell Highway, making it an important stopping point for travelers heading north to Dawson City or west toward Ross River. The gas station where I worked was open 24 hours a day to serve the steady stream of long-haul truckers, tourists, and mining workers who passed through town at all hours. During the day shift, there was plenty of business, but the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. was usually dead quiet, with maybe 3 or 4 customers during the entire 8-hour period. Most nights I spent my time reading magazines, restocking shelves, and counting down the hours until my replacement arrived in the morning. That changed on the night of June 15th, 1998, when a man stumbled into the station around 2:30 a.m. in a state of obvious distress. He was a white male, approximately 35 years old, medium height and build, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt that was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. His face and hands were scratched, and he was breathing heavily as if he had been running. When he entered the store, he immediately approached the counter where I was sitting and began talking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain what had happened to him. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he claimed to be driving from Whitehorse to Dawson City when he had picked up a hitchhiker south of Carmax. According to his story, the hitchhiker had been a young Aboriginal woman, perhaps in her early 20s, who had been standing beside the highway with her thumb out around midnight. Brennan said that he had stopped to give her a ride because it was cold, and he felt sorry for anyone trying to hitchhike in the middle of the night. The woman had gotten into his pickup truck and told him that she was trying to get to Dawson City to visit family members. According to Brennan's account, everything had been normal for the first few kilometers after he picked up the hitchhiker. They had made small talk about the weather and the road conditions, and the woman had seemed friendly and grateful for the ride. But as they approached the outskirts of Carmax, Brennan claimed that the woman's behavior had suddenly changed. She had become agitated and aggressive, accusing him of driving too fast and demanding that he pull over immediately. When he had tried to calm her down and explain that they were almost in town, she had pulled out a knife and threatened to kill him. Brennan told me that he had managed to stop his truck and get out before the woman could stab him, but that she had chased him with the knife, slashing at him and trying to cut his throat. He claimed that he had fought her off and managed to escape, but that she had gotten away with his truck and all of his belongings. The scratches on his face and hands were from the knife attack, and the blood on his shirt was his own. He wanted me to call the RCMP immediately so that they could arrest the woman and recover his stolen vehicle. The story seemed plausible enough, and Brennan appeared genuinely traumatized by whatever had happened to him. I called the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse and reported the incident, providing them with Brennan's description of the hitchhiker and his truck. While we waited for the police to arrive, I gave Brennan some coffee and a clean towel to wipe the blood off his face. He continued to talk about the attack, providing more details about the woman's appearance and behavior, and expressing concern about other motorists who might pick her up not knowing that she was dangerous. 2 RCMP officers arrived at the gas station about an hour later, and they immediately began interviewing Brennan about the incident. I could overhear parts of their conversation from behind the counter, and it was clear that the officers were taking his report seriously. They called for additional units to begin searching for the stolen truck and the suspect, and they arranged for Brennan to be taken to the nursing station in Carmax to have his injuries examined and treated. Before they left, one of the officers asked me to provide a statement about what Brennan had told me and what condition he had been in when he arrived at the station. The investigation continued throughout the following day, with RCMP officers interviewing residents of Carmax and nearby communities to determine if anyone had seen the hitchhiker or the stolen truck. Roadblocks were established on the highways leading north and south from Carmax, and all vehicles matching the description of Brennan's truck were stopped and searched. The local radio station broadcast bulletins warning motorists not to pick up hitchhikers in the area and describing the suspect as armed and dangerous. But as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge in Brennan's story. The first problem was that no one in Carmax or the surrounding area had seen any hitchhikers on the night of the incident. The highway through that area was well traveled, and local residents were accustomed to seeing people walking along the road or trying to catch rides. Several truckers who had driven through the area around midnight reported that they had not seen anyone hitchhiking, which was unusual because hitchhikers typically position themselves at locations where they would be visible to as many drivers as possible. More significantly, there were no witnesses to corroborate any part of Brennan's story. No one had seen him pick up a hitchhiker, no one had seen a struggle beside the highway, and no one had seen his truck being driven by anyone other than himself. The RCMP officers also noted that Brennan's injuries were inconsistent with his description of a knife attack. The scratches on his face and hands appeared to be superficial and self-inflicted, more like scratches from branches or fingernails than cuts from a knife blade. On June 17th, 2 days after the initial incident, a local Aboriginal woman named Sarah Nacho was reported missing by her family. Sarah was 23 years old, unemployed, and lived with her grandmother in a small house on the outskirts of Carmacks. She had last been seen on the evening of June 15th, when she had told her grandmother that she was going for a walk along the river. When she failed to return home that night, her family had assumed that she was staying with friends, but when she did not appear the following day, they became concerned and contacted the RCMP. The timing of Sarah's disappearance, combined with the inconsistencies in Brennan's story, led investigators to take a closer look at his account of the hitchhiker incident. When they re-interviewed him, asking more specific questions about his movements on the night of June 15th, his story began to change in significant ways. Details that he had been certain about during his initial report became vague or were contradicted by new information that he provided. Most importantly, he was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for why he had been driving through Carmacks in the middle of the night, when his stated destination was Dawson City. On June 20th, RCMP officers obtained a search warrant for Brennan's motel room in Whitehorse, where he had been staying since the incident. During the search, they discovered several items that connected him to Sarah Nacho's disappearance. Among his belongings were pieces of women's jewelry that Sarah's grandmother identified as having belonged to her granddaughter. There were also photographs of Sarah that had been taken without her knowledge, apparently while Brennan had been stalking her in the days before her disappearance. Most damaging of all, investigators found Sarah's body buried in a shallow grave beside the Yukon River, approximately 5 kilometers south of Carmacks. The location was in a remote area that was not visible from the highway, but that could be reached by driving on mining access roads that Brennan had somehow known about, despite claiming to be unfamiliar with the area. Sarah had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and the physical evidence at the burial site clearly linked Brennan to the crime. When confronted with this evidence, Brennan initially maintained his innocence and continued to insist that he had been the victim of an attack by a dangerous hitchhiker. But when investigators pointed out the inconsistencies in his story and presented him with the physical evidence that connected him to Sarah's murder, he eventually confessed to the crime. His confession revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that was far more disturbing than the random attack he had initially described. According to his confession, Brennan had been stalking Sarah for several weeks before killing her. He had learned her daily routines, discovered where she lived, and planned the abduction carefully. On the night of June 15th, he had followed her when she went for her evening walk along the river, then had abducted her at gunpoint and forced her into his truck. He had driven her to the remote location where he had sexually assaulted and murdered her, then had buried her body and driven to the gas station to establish an alibi by claiming to be the victim of an attack. The fabricated story about the hitchhiker had been designed to explain his injuries, which he had inflicted on himself, to make his account more believable, and to divert police attention away from him and toward a fictional suspect. Brennan had assumed that the investigation would focus on finding the non-existent hitchhiker, giving him time to leave the territory before Sarah's body was discovered or before anyone connected him to her disappearance. During the investigation that followed his confession, police discovered that Brennan had been involved in similar crimes in other jurisdictions. He was originally from Ontario, where he had been investigated in connection with several missing persons cases involving young women, though he had never been charged due to lack of evidence. He had moved to British Columbia in 1995, then to the Yukon in 1997, each time after being questioned by police about disappearances in his previous location. Thomas Brennan was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Nacho and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. During his trial, Evidence was presented suggesting that he might have been responsible for the disappearances of other women along the Alaska Highway, but he was never charged with additional crimes due to insufficient evidence. He remains incarcerated at a federal penitentiary in British Columbia, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. The murder of Sarah Nacho devastated the small community of Carmacks, where violent crime was extremely rare, and where most people knew each other personally. Sarah had been well liked in the community, and her death highlighted the vulnerability of young Aboriginal women in remote northern communities. Her case also demonstrated how predators could exploit the trust and helpfulness that characterize small-town life, using people's willingness to help strangers as a way to avoid suspicion. For me personally, the case was a brutal introduction to the reality that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary appearances. Thomas Brennan had seemed like any other customer when he walked into the gas station that night, just a victim of a random crime who needed help. The fact that he was actually a cold-blooded killer who had just murdered an innocent young woman was something that I never could have imagined at the time. The experience taught me to be more suspicious of people's motives and more aware of the potential for deception in human interactions. Even now, more than 25 years later, I still think about that night whenever I drive through Carmacks. The gas station where I worked has been torn down and replaced with a newer facility, but the memory of that encounter with Thomas Brennan remains vivid. Sarah Nacho's death was a tragedy that should never have happened, and her killer's manipulation of the justice system through his fabricated hitchhiker story was an additional insult to her memory and her family. The case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who appear most normal and sympathetic, and that evil can hide behind a mask of victimhood. My name is Daniel Roy, and I am a bush pilot who has flown over every inch of the Yukon. There is one valley I refuse to fly over anymore after what I witnessed in 1999. I have been flying in the Northern Territories for over 25 years, providing transportation and supply services to mining camps, research stations, and remote communities throughout the Yukon and Northwest Territories. In that time, I have seen everything from severe weather conditions to wildlife migrations to the Northern Lights, but I have never experienced anything that challenged my understanding of the natural world until that October afternoon, when I decided to take a shortcut through an unnamed valley in the Richardson Mountains. I've always prided myself on being a practical, no-nonsense pilot who focuses on safety and efficiency above all else. Flying in the Arctic requires a level of caution and preparation that would be considered excessive in more temperate regions, but it is absolutely necessary when you are operating hundreds of kilometers from the nearest help in temperatures that can drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius. I do not believe in ghost stories or supernatural phenomena, and I have always been able to find rational explanations for anything unusual that I have encountered during my flights. That changed completely during what should have been a routine supply run to a mining camp near Eagle Plains. On October 15th, 1999, I was flying from Whitehorse to a remote mining operation located approximately 400 kilometers northeast of the city, near the border with the Northwest Territories. My aircraft was a de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter, a reliable twin-engine plane that is perfectly suited for northern operations because of its ability to land on short, unpaved airstrips and carry substantial cargo loads. I was transporting supplies and mail to the mining camp, along with 2 replacement workers who were scheduled to begin their shifts the following day. The weather forecast for the day had called for clear skies and moderate winds, perfect flying conditions for the 3-hour journey to the mining camp. I had filed a flight plan that would take me northeast from Whitehorse, following the Klondike Highway corridor for the first portion of the flight, then continuing across the wilderness areas of the northern Yukon until reaching the mining camp. It was a route that I had flown dozens of times before, and I expected no complications or delays. About 2 hours into the flight, As we were flying over the Richardson Mountains at an altitude of approximately 8,000 feet, I spotted what appeared to be a valley that could provide a more direct route to our destination. The valley was oriented in a northeast-southwest direction, perfectly aligned with our desired flight path, and it appeared to be wide enough and free of obstacles that would make it safe to fly through rather than over. Taking this shortcut would save approximately 15 minutes of flight time and reduce our fuel consumption, both of which are important considerations when flying in remote areas where emergency landing options are extremely limited. I had never flown through this particular valley before, but it was clearly marked on my aeronautical charts as being suitable for aircraft operations. There were no warnings or restrictions noted, and the terrain appeared to be typical of other valleys in the Richardson Mountains that I had flown through many times. I informed the two passengers about the route change and began descending to a lower altitude that would allow us to fly through the valley rather than over the surrounding peaks. As we entered the valley, flying at approximately 2,000 feet above the valley floor, I immediately noticed that my radio equipment began experiencing interference. The static was not severe enough to prevent communication entirely, but it was unusual because we had been receiving clear transmissions throughout the earlier portion of the flight. I assumed that the mountains were causing some kind of radio shadow effect, which is common when flying through valleys surrounded by high terrain. What happened next was completely outside the realm of any normal flying experience. As I looked down at the valley floor below us, I saw what appeared to be people running across the landscape. Not just a few individuals, but dozens of people, all running in the same direction, as if they were fleeing from some kind of threat. From our altitude, they appeared to be dressed in what looked like historical clothing, not the modern outdoor gear that would be expected from hikers or hunters in such a remote location. At first, I thought that we might be witnessing some kind of emergency situation, perhaps a hiking group that had encountered bears or had become lost and was trying to signal for help. I considered changing course to get a closer look and possibly provide assistance, but as I maneuvered the aircraft for a better view, I realized that what I was seeing made no logical sense. The figures below us were running across terrain that would have been impossible for living people to traverse at the speed they were moving. They were covering ground at what appeared to be superhuman speed, leaping across ravines and climbing steep slopes without any apparent effort or hesitation. More disturbing still, they appeared to be translucent, like images projected onto the landscape rather than solid physical beings. As I continued to watch, the figures began to change their behavior in ways that became increasingly terrifying. Instead of simply running across the landscape, they began to turn and look up at our aircraft, pointing at us and gesturing as if they were trying to communicate or warn us about something. Their faces, which had been indistinct from our altitude, suddenly became clearly visible despite the distance, showing expressions of absolute terror and desperation. Then I began to hear them screaming. This should have been impossible because we were flying at 2,000 feet above the ground in a pressurized aircraft with engines running. But their screams were coming through the radio system as clearly as if they were sitting in the cabin with us. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before, full of pain and desperation and fear, but also something else that I cannot adequately describe. It was the sound of people who were experiencing something so horrible that it transcended normal human experience. The two passengers in the cabin had also noticed that something was wrong. One of them, a mining engineer named Claude Martineau, asked me if I was receiving some kind of emergency broadcast on the radio. The other passenger, an equipment operator named Michel Beaulieu, pointed out the window and asked if I could see the people running on the ground below us. It was some small comfort to realize that I was not experiencing hallucinations, but it was also terrifying to know that whatever was happening was real enough for all three of us to witness. As the screaming continued, my aircraft began to experience mechanical problems that had no apparent cause. The engine performance indicators began fluctuating wildly, showing readings that made no sense given the actual operating conditions. The flight controls became sluggish and unresponsive, as if some external force was interfering with the aircraft's systems. Most alarming of all, the altimeter began showing that we were losing altitude rapidly, even though I had not changed the engine settings or control inputs. Looking outside the aircraft, I could see that we were indeed descending toward the valley floor, apparently against my efforts to maintain level flight. The screaming figures below us had stopped running and were now standing still, all facing upward toward our aircraft with their arms extended as if they were trying to grab us or pull us down to join them. As we continued to descend, I could see their faces more clearly, and what I saw convinced me that these were not living people, but something else entirely. Their faces showed injuries that would have been fatal to any living person. Some had wounds that appeared to be from weapons. Others showed signs of burning or crushing injuries, and all of them had the gray, lifeless complexion of corpses that had been dead for a long time. But their eyes were still alive, still aware, and filled with a desperate need that I understood instinctively, even though I could not have explained it in words. They wanted us to join them, to become part of whatever horrible fate had befallen them in this valley. I realized that we were in immediate danger of crashing, and I began emergency procedures to restore full power to the engines and regain control of the aircraft. At the same time, I changed course to exit the valley as quickly as possible, regardless of fuel efficiency or flight time considerations. The moment we crossed the ridgeline that marked the boundary of the valley, all of the strange phenomena stopped immediately. The radio interference disappeared, the engine performance returned to normal, and the screaming stopped as abruptly as it had begun. We completed the flight to the mining camp without further incident, but none of us spoke about what we had experienced during the remainder of the journey. After delivering the passengers and cargo, I filed a routine flight report that made no mention of the unusual events in the valley. I was not sure that anyone would believe what had happened, and I was concerned that reporting supernatural phenomena might affect my pilot's license or my reputation within the aviation community. Over the following days, I researched the history of the valley where we had experienced the phenomena, using historical records and geological surveys to determine if there might be some rational explanation for what we had witnessed. What I discovered was deeply disturbing and provided a possible context for our experience, though it did not make it any less frightening or mysterious. According to historical records maintained by the territorial government and various academic institutions, the valley had been the site of a massacre that occurred approximately 200 years ago, during a period of conflict between different indigenous groups in the region. The details were sketchy and largely based on oral histories that had been passed down through several generations, but the accounts consistently described a battle in which dozens of people were killed in brutal circumstances. The massacre had reportedly occurred during winter, when one group had taken refuge in the valley during a blizzard, only to be attacked by their enemies who had tracked them there. The people in the valley had been trapped by the weather and the terrain, unable to escape, and had been systematically hunted down and killed over a period of several days. According to the oral histories, the screams of the victims had echoed off the valley walls for days, creating an acoustic effect that amplified the sounds of their suffering. The historical accounts also mentioned that the valley had been considered cursed or haunted by indigenous peoples in the region for generations after the massacre. Hunting parties avoided the area, and travel routes were established that went around the valley rather than through it, even when this meant considerably longer journeys through difficult terrain. The valley had essentially been abandoned and left uninhabited, which explained why it appeared so pristine and untouched when I had flown over it. I have never flown through that valley again, and I have modified all of my flight routes to ensure that I do not even fly directly over it. I have also quietly advised other pilots to avoid the area, though I have never provided specific details about why they should stay away. Most of them have accepted my advice without question, trusting my experience and knowledge of northern flying conditions. The experience has had a lasting impact on my understanding of the world and my approach to flying in remote areas. I have become much more cautious about taking shortcuts through unfamiliar terrain, and I pay closer attention to historical and cultural information about the areas where I operate. I have also developed a greater respect for indigenous knowledge and oral traditions, recognizing that they often contain important information about places and phenomena that are not documented in official records. Claude Martineau and Michel Beaulieu, the two passengers who witnessed the events with me, have both left the Yukon and moved to southern Canada. I encountered Claude several years later at an aviation conference in Calgary, and he mentioned that the experience had convinced him to find work that did not require flying to remote locations. He said that he still had nightmares about the screaming figures in the valley, and that he never wanted to fly over the northern wilderness again. To this day, I believe that certain locations retain the psychic imprint of traumatic events that occurred there, particularly when those events involved intense suffering and death. The valley in the Richardson Mountains is one such place, where the boundary between the past and the present has become permeable, allowing the echoes of an ancient tragedy to manifest in the physical world. The figures we saw were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but rather the preserved memory of people who died in circumstances so horrible that their final moments became permanently etched into the landscape itself. I continue to work as a bush pilot, but I have never forgotten the lesson I learned in that valley. There are places in the world where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the living can still encounter the suffering of the dead. The Screaming Valley remains off limits to me, a reminder that some shortcuts are far too dangerous to take, regardless of the time or fuel they might save. My grandfather, Jacques Fournier, was part of the team that discovered something impossible in the permafrost near Old Crow in 1978. Grandpère had worked in construction and excavation throughout the Yukon for over 30 years, and he thought he had seen everything that the frozen ground could yield up. He had helped build roads, foundations for buildings, and even airstrips in some of the most remote locations in the territory. During all those years of digging through permafrost that had been frozen solid for thousands of years, he had occasionally found the preserved remains of ancient animals, mammoth bones, and even the perfectly preserved carcasses of Ice Age creatures that looked like they had died yesterday rather than millennia ago. But what he discovered during the construction of a new community center in Old Crow was something that challenged everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the natural world. My name is André Lavoie, and I'm telling you this story because Grandpère made me promise on his deathbed that I would share the truth about what happened during that construction project, even though the government had classified the incident and forbidden anyone involved from discussing it publicly. Some truths are too important to remain buried, especially when they concern the discovery of something that could change our understanding of human history and the nature of life itself. Old Crow is a small Gwich'in community located in the northern Yukon, about 800 kilometers north of Whitehorse and well above the Arctic Circle. In 1978, the community had a population of approximately 300 people, most of whom lived in houses that had been built during the 1960s as part of a government program to provide modern housing for indigenous families. The community center that was being constructed was intended to serve as a meeting place, recreation facility, and emergency shelter for residents during the harsh Arctic winters when temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Grandpère was working as the foreman for a construction crew that had been contracted to excavate the foundation for the new community center. The building was going to be relatively large by Old Crow standards, requiring a foundation that extended approximately 4 feet below ground level to ensure stability and proper insulation from the permafrost. The excavation work was challenging because the ground was permanently frozen to a depth of several hundred feet, requiring specialized equipment and techniques to break through the rock-hard soil and ice. The construction project began in late June 1978, during the brief Arctic summer when surface temperatures were warm enough to allow outdoor work. Even during the summer months, the permafrost remained solid below a depth of about 2 feet, meaning that the excavation required jackhammers, steam thawing equipment, and other heavy machinery to break through the frozen ground. The work was slow and expensive, but it was the only way to create a foundation that would remain stable through the extreme temperature variations of the Arctic climate. On July the 15th, Grandpere's crew had been excavating for about 3 weeks and had reached a depth of approximately 3.5 feet when they struck something unusual. Instead of the typical permafrost layers consisting of frozen soil, rocks, and organic matter, they encountered what appeared to be a layer of clear ice that was perfectly transparent and contained what looked like air bubbles or inclusions. The ice layer was about 6 inches thick and extended across the entire excavation area, suggesting that it was a natural formation rather than something that had been created by human activity. At first, Grandpere and his crew assumed that they had encountered a layer of ground ice, which is not uncommon in permafrost regions. Ground ice forms when water seeps into the soil and freezes, creating lenses or layers of pure ice within the frozen ground. However, as they began to break through the ice layer using steam thawing equipment, they realized that the inclusions they had observed were not air bubbles, but something far more extraordinary and disturbing. The inclusions in the ice were human bodies, perfectly preserved, and appearing as fresh as if they had been frozen just days earlier, rather than being trapped in permafrost for unknown periods of time. The bodies were positioned in various poses, as some appearing to be sleeping peacefully, while others seemed to be in the middle of some kind of activity when they were frozen. All of the bodies were dressed in clothing that appeared to be made from animal skins and furs, but the style and construction were unlike anything that Grandpere had seen before, even from historical examples of traditional indigenous clothing. As the crew continued to carefully thaw the ice layer, they uncovered a total of 7 bodies: 3 adult males, 2 adult females, 1 adolescent, who appeared to be about 14 years old, and 1 child who looked to be approximately 8 years old. All of the bodies were in remarkable condition with no signs of decay or deterioration, despite being frozen in the permafrost. Their skin had a slightly blue-gray tint that was consistent with extreme cold, but their features were perfectly preserved, and their hair and clothing showed no signs of damage from ice formation or freezing. Grandpere immediately contacted his supervisors and the territorial government to report the discovery, as required by law when human remains are found during construction projects. Representatives from the Territorial Archaeological Service, the RCMP, and the Department of Indian Affairs arrived in Old Crow within 2 days to examine the site and take custody of the bodies. Carbon dating samples were taken from the clothing and organic materials found with the bodies, and initial analysis suggested that they were over 10,000 years old, dating from a period when the climate in the region was very different from current conditions. What happened next was what convinced Grandpere that he had witnessed something that defied all scientific understanding of life and death. As the bodies were being carefully removed from the ice and prepared for transport to laboratories in Whitehorse and Edmonton, they began to show signs of life. It started with barely perceptible movements, slight changes in facial expressions, and what appeared to be very slow, shallow breathing. The archaeologists and government officials initially dismissed these observations as tricks of light or imagination, assuming that the construction workers were seeing things that were not really there. But as the bodies were exposed to warmer air temperatures, the signs of life became increasingly obvious and undeniable. Eyes that had been closed began to flutter and partially open, revealing pupils that responded to light. Chest movements became more pronounced, suggesting actual breathing rather than just the expansion and contraction of frozen tissue. Most dramatically, several of the bodies began to make sounds, quiet vocalizations that sounded like attempts to speak, though the words were in a language that none of the observers could identify. The adult male, who appeared to be the oldest of the group, was the first to show clear signs of consciousness. His eyes opened fully and moved around, as if he was trying to observe his surroundings. He attempted to sit up, though his movements were slow and unsteady like someone recovering from a long illness. When government officials tried to communicate with him, he responded with what sounded like questions or requests, speaking in a language that had elements similar to various indigenous languages, but was unlike any known dialect or historical linguistic variation. Over the next several hours, all 7 of the bodies showed increasing signs of life and awareness. They appeared to be confused and frightened by their surroundings, particularly by the presence of people wearing modern clothing and speaking English. The younger individuals clung to the adults, and the group seemed to be trying to communicate among themselves using their unknown language. Medical examinations revealed that their vital signs were weak but present, with heart rates and breathing patterns that were consistent with people recovering from severe hypothermia. The most disturbing aspect of their revival was that it was clearly temporary. Despite the efforts of medical personnel to stabilize and warm them, the individuals began to deteriorate rapidly once they were fully exposed to normal air temperatures. Their skin began to darken and show signs of rapid decomposition, and their vital signs became increasingly erratic. Within 12 hours of being removed from the ice, all 7 individuals had died, their bodies rapidly decomposing in ways that suggested they were catching up on thousands of years of natural decay in a matter of hours. The entire incident was immediately classified by the federal government under the Official Secrets Act, and all personnel who had witnessed the events were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing what they had seen. The bodies were taken to undisclosed government research facilities, and the construction site was declared off-limits to civilians. The community center project was canceled, officially due to budget constraints, though the real reason was to prevent any further disturbance of the permafrost in that area. Grandpere was told that the incident had never occurred and that he would face serious legal consequences if he ever discussed it with anyone outside of his immediate family. The other construction workers received similar warnings, and the project site was abandoned and left undisturbed. The area was eventually designated as culturally sensitive land and removed from future development plans, ensuring that no one would ever again excavate in that location. Over the years that followed, Grandpere quietly researched the history and geology of the Old Crow area, trying to understand what he had witnessed and how it might be possible for human beings to survive being frozen for thousands of years. He learned that the region had experienced several dramatic climate changes throughout its history, including periods when temperatures dropped so rapidly that entire communities might have been flash frozen in place. He also discovered that the specific type of permafrost found in that area contained unusual mineral compositions that might have contributed to the preservation of organic matter. Grandpere believed that the 7 individuals they had discovered represented a group of ancient people who had been caught in some kind of rapid climate change event that had flash frozen them in a state of suspended animation. The ice layer that had preserved them was not ordinary ground ice, but a unique formation that had maintained their bodies in a state somewhere between life and death for thousands of years. When they were exposed to normal temperatures, their bodies had briefly resumed biological functions before the accumulated effects of their long preservation finally caught up with them. The experience had a profound impact on Grandpère's understanding of life and death, and he spent the rest of his career avoiding construction projects that required deep excavation in permafrost areas. He believed that there were probably other similar discoveries waiting to be made throughout the Arctic regions of Canada, Russia, and Alaska, where rapid climate changes had occurred throughout geological history. The melting of permafrost due to modern climate change was likely to expose more of these preserved individuals, but he feared that the government would continue to suppress and classify such discoveries to avoid public panic. When Grandpère told me this story during his final illness in 2003, he made me promise that I would eventually share it with others, despite the risks involved. He believed that people had a right to know about discoveries that might change our understanding of human history and the possibility of life after death. He also worried that the government's policy of classifying and suppressing such discoveries was preventing scientific research that might lead to important medical breakthroughs related to preservation of human life and treatment of terminal illnesses. Grandpère died knowing that he had witnessed something extraordinary, something that suggested that the boundary between life and death was not as absolute as most people believed. The 7 ancient people who had briefly returned to life after thousands of years of frozen sleep had proven that consciousness and biological function could be preserved far longer than anyone had thought possible. Their story remains classified and officially never happened, but Grandpère believed that the truth about what was discovered in the permafrost near Old Crow deserved to be remembered and shared. To this day, I believe that there are others, like those 7 individuals, still frozen in the permafrost throughout the Arctic regions, waiting to be discovered as the ice melts and the ground thaws. Each discovery represents not just an archaeological find, but a potential glimpse into forms of human experience that challenge our basic assumptions about the nature of life itself. The frozen survivors of Old Crow may have been the first such discovery in Canadian territory, but they were certainly not the last, and their brief return to life proved that some boundaries are not as permanent as we believe them to be. My great-grandmother, Amélie Lavoie, lived through the Klondike Gold Rush. On her deathbed, she told me about the winter of 1898, when starvation drove men to unthinkable acts. Grand-mère had been one of the few women who had made the treacherous journey over the Chilkoot Pass to reach the gold fields of the Klondike, arriving in Dawson City during the height of the gold rush fever, when tens of thousands of prospectors were flooding into the territory in search of fortune. She had come not as a prospector herself, but as the wife of a man who had been convinced that the stories of easy gold were true, and who had mortgaged everything they owned to finance the journey to what he believed would be their salvation from poverty. My name is Simone Gagnon, and I'm telling you this story because Grand-mère made me promise that the truth about what happened during that terrible winter would not be forgotten, even though it was something that the survivors had agreed never to speak about publicly. The events she described took place during one of the harshest winters in Yukon history, when temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for weeks at a time, and when even the most experienced northern residents struggled to survive the unrelenting cold and darkness. By the fall of 1898, the initial excitement of the Klondike Gold Rush had given way to harsh reality for most of the stampeders who had made the difficult journey north. The easily accessible gold had already been claimed by the first wave of prospectors, and newcomers were forced to work increasingly marginal claims or to venture into remote areas where the chances of finding gold were slim, but the dangers were extreme. Many prospectors who had arrived with high hopes and limited resources found themselves trapped in the territory as winter approached, lacking the money to return home, but also lacking the supplies necessary to survive the northern winter. Grand-mère's husband, my great-grandfather Philippe, had been one of these latecomers who found himself in desperate circumstances as the weather began to turn cold. He had spent the summer working a claim on Bonanza Creek that had produced barely enough gold to pay for basic supplies, and by September, it was clear that he would not have enough money to book passage back to Quebec before the rivers froze and made transportation impossible. Like hundreds of other prospectors in similar situations, he made the decision to spend the winter in the Klondike, gambling that he could survive until spring and that the following season would bring better fortune. The problem was that Philippe, like most of the stampeders, had no real understanding of what winter meant in the Yukon Territory. He had grown up in Quebec, where the winters were certainly cold and difficult, but nothing had prepared him for the bone-numbing cold and prolonged darkness of the subarctic. More importantly, he had not accumulated adequate supplies for surviving a winter in isolation, and by October, it was too late to obtain the food, fuel, and clothing that would be essential for making it through to spring. In desperation, Philippe joined a group of 5 other prospectors who were in similar circumstances and who decided to pool their resources and spend the winter together in a large cabin that had been built by earlier prospectors near the mouth of El Dorado Creek. The group consisted of Philippe, a man named Antoine Berube from New Brunswick who had worked as a logger before coming north, 2 brothers named Paul and Henri Dubois from Ontario who had been farmers, and an older man named Joseph Martineau from Manitoba, who had experience in the fur trade and was the only member of the group who had any real knowledge of northern survival techniques. The cabin where they planned to spend the winter was well built and large enough to accommodate all 6 men, but it was located in an extremely isolated area, more than 20 kilometers from the nearest neighbor, and completely cut off from Dawson City once the trails became impassable. The group had managed to accumulate enough food supplies to last approximately 4 months if they were very careful with their rations, and they had enough firewood and coal to keep the cabin heated through the coldest part of the winter. By the standards of most Klondike prospectors, they were reasonably well prepared for the challenges ahead. The winter of 1898 to 1899 began earlier and more severely than anyone had anticipated. By mid-October, temperatures were already dropping below -30 degrees, and by November, the cold had become so intense that it was dangerous to venture outside for more than a few minutes at a time. Snow began falling in early November and continued almost daily throughout the rest of the month, piling up around the cabin to depths that made travel impossible even on snowshoes. By December, the 6 men were completely isolated, with no possibility of reaching Dawson City or any other source of help until the weather moderated in the spring. The food supplies that had seemed adequate in the fall began to run low much faster than expected. The extreme cold meant that the men needed more calories to maintain their body temperature, and the enforced confinement in the cabin made it impossible to hunt or trap the wild game that might have supplemented their rations. By January, they were down to 1 small meal per day, and by February, they were facing the very real prospect of starvation before the spring thaw arrived. It was during this period of increasing desperation that Grandmère said Antoine Berube began making what he called hunting trips, leaving the cabin for hours at a time despite the dangerous cold and returning with small amounts of meat that he claimed to have obtained by snaring rabbits or ptarmigan. The other men were grateful for these contributions to their dwindling food supply, though they wondered how Antoine was managing to catch game when their own efforts had been completely unsuccessful. The meat was always cut into small pieces and mixed with other ingredients to make stew, so it was difficult to identify exactly what kind of animal it came from. As the weeks passed and the other men grew weaker from hunger, Antoine seemed to be maintaining his strength better than the rest of the group. He continued to make his hunting expeditions, and he continued to provide small amounts of meat for the communal pot, though he was always vague about exactly where and how he was obtaining it. When the other men asked to accompany him on his hunting trips, he refused, claiming that he was using techniques that he had learned from native trappers and that the presence of additional people would scare away the game. The first disappearance occurred in early March when Paul Dubois failed to wake up one morning. Antoine claimed that Paul had died during the night from starvation and cold, which seemed plausible given how weak all of the men had become. However, when the others wanted to examine the body to confirm the cause of death and to discuss arrangements for burial, Antoine insisted that he had already taken care of the matter, disposing of the corpse outside the cabin to prevent the spread of disease. This explanation seemed reasonable at the time, though Grand-Mère said that Philippe had begun to feel uneasy about Antoine's behavior. A week later, Henri Dubois also disappeared during the night, and once again, Antoine claimed that the man had died from malnutrition and that he had disposed of the body for health reasons. By this time, Philippe and Joseph Martineau were becoming suspicious about the pattern of deaths and Antoine's secretive behavior regarding the disposal of the bodies. More disturbing still, they had noticed that Antoine's hunting expeditions had become less frequent after the two deaths, yet he continued to provide meat for their meals. The horrible truth began to dawn on Philippe when he discovered human bones behind the cabin, partially buried in the snow and showing clear evidence of having been butchered with knives and saws. The bones were too large to have come from any game animal that could be found in the Yukon, and some of them still had fragments of clothing and personal items attached that belonged to Paul and Henri Dubois. When Philippe confronted Antoine about his discovery, Antoine initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually admitted that he had been killing and eating his companions to survive the winter. According to Antoine's confession, he had been planning from the beginning of the winter to murder the other men if their food supplies ran out. He had deliberately underestimated their rations and had been hoarding food for himself while allowing the others to gradually starve, weakening them to the point where they would be unable to resist when he decided to kill them. The meat that he had been contributing to their communal meals had been human flesh from the first victims, meaning that Philippe and Joseph had been unknowingly participating in cannibalism for weeks. The revelation that they had been eating human flesh was almost as horrifying to Philippe and Joseph as the realization that Antoine was systematically murdering his companions. Both men were devoutly religious Catholics who viewed cannibalism as one of the most grievous sins possible, and the knowledge that they had been forced to participate in such acts, even unknowingly, was spiritually devastating. But their immediate concern was survival, as it was clear that Antoine intended to kill them both as soon as he felt it was necessary. Philippe and Joseph realized that they had to escape from the cabin immediately, despite the fact that the temperature was still dropping to -50 degrees at night, and that they had no survival equipment or adequate clothing for travel in such conditions. Their only hope was to try to reach Dawson City before Antoine decided to murder them, or before they froze to death in the wilderness. They waited until Antoine was sleeping, then quietly gathered what few supplies they could carry and slipped out of the cabin into the brutal Arctic night. The journey to Dawson City, which should have taken less than a day in good conditions, took Philippe and Joseph nearly a week in the deep snow and extreme cold. They took turns carrying each other when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, and they survived by digging snow shelters and sharing their body heat during the coldest parts of the night. Both men suffered severe frostbite, and Joseph developed pneumonia that would eventually contribute to his death several months later. But they managed to reach Dawson City alive, where they immediately reported Antoine's crimes to the Northwest Mounted Police. A police expedition to the cabin found Antoine Berube in the final stages of starvation, surrounded by the butchered remains of his 4 victims. He was too weak to resist arrest, and he made a full confession to the murders and cannibalism before being transported to Dawson City for trial. The investigation revealed that he had been systematically killing and eating his companions over a period of nearly 2 months, and that he had been planning the crimes from the very beginning of their winter isolation, Antoine Berube was tried and convicted of multiple counts of murder in the summer of 1899, but he died in custody before his sentence could be carried out. The case was reported in newspapers throughout North America, but the authorities in the Yukon Territory made efforts to minimize publicity about the incident because they feared that stories about cannibalism would damage the reputation of the Klondike and discourage further investment in the gold rush. The official records of the case were sealed and have never been made available to researchers or historians. Felipe never fully recovered from his ordeal, physically or psychologically. The frostbite he had suffered during his escape left him permanently disabled, and the knowledge that he had been forced to consume human flesh haunted him for the rest of his life. He and Grandmère left the Yukon Territory as soon as he was physically able to travel, returning to Quebec, where they lived in relative isolation and rarely spoke about their experiences during the gold rush. Grandmère said that Philippe would wake up screaming from nightmares about Antoine and the winter at the cabin until the day he died, more than 30 years later. She also said that he was never able to eat meat again without becoming physically ill, surviving primarily on bread, vegetables, and dairy products for the remainder of his life. The trauma of the experience had changed him so fundamentally that he was never the same person he had been before that terrible winter. When Grandmère told me this story in 1965, she said that there had been other cases of cannibalism during the Klondike Gold Rush that had been covered up by the authorities to protect the territory's reputation. She believed that dozens of prospectors had resorted to eating human flesh during the worst winters, and that some, like Antoine Berube, had committed murder specifically for that purpose. The isolation and desperation of the gold rush had brought out the worst aspects of human nature, turning ordinary men into monsters who were capable of the most depraved acts imaginable. The story of Antoine Berube and the winter of 1898 serves as a reminder that extreme circumstances can drive people to commit acts that would be unthinkable under normal conditions. The Klondike Gold Rush was not just a story of adventure and fortune-seeking, but also a story of human suffering, desperation, and moral collapse. For every successful prospector who found gold and returned home wealthy, there were dozens of others who died from cold, starvation, disease, or violence. Some, like Antoine Berube, became predators who turned their fellow human beings into prey, demonstrating that civilization is a fragile veneer that can be stripped away by hunger and desperation.